Task A was unbounded and of low intensity before you switched. But even if you finish Task A before moving on, your attention remains divided for a while.
Who's next?
Leroy studied the effect of this attention residue on performance by forcing task switches in the laboratory. In one such experiment, for example, she started her subjects working on a set of word puzzles. In one of the trials, she would interrupt them and tell them that they needed to move on to a new and challenging task, in this case, reading resumes and making hypothetical hiring decisions. In other trials, she let the subjects finish the puzzles before giving them the next task. In between puzzling and hiring, she would deploy a quick lexical decision game to quantify the amount of residue left from the first task. The results from this and her similar experiments were clear. People experiencing attention residue after switching tasks are likely to demonstrate poor performance on that next task. And the more intense the residue, the worse the performance.
30 seconds left.
The concept of attention residue helps explain why the intensity formula is true, and therefore helps explain Grant's productivity. By working on a single hard task for a long time without switching, Grant minimizes the negative impact of attention residue from his other obligations, allowing him to maximize performance on this one task. When Grant is working for days in isolation on a paper, in other words, he's doing so at a higher level of effectiveness than the standard professor following a more distracted strategy in which the work is repeatedly interrupted by residue-slathering interruptions. Even if you're unable to fully replicate Grant's extreme isolation, we'll tackle different strategies for scheduling depth in Part 2, the attention residue concept is still telling, because it implies that the common habit of working in a state of semi-distraction is potentially devastating to your performance. It might seem harmless to take a quick glance at your inbox every 10 minutes or so. Indeed, many justify this behavior as better than the old practice of leaving an inbox open on the screen at all times, a straw man habit that few follow anymore. But Leroy teaches us that this is not, in fact, much of an improvement. That quick check introduces a new target for your attention. Even worse, by seeing messages that you cannot deal with at the moment, which is almost always the case, you'll be forced to turn back to the primary task with a secondary task left unfinished. The attention residue left by such unresolved switches dampens your performance. When we step back from these individual observations, we see a clear argument formed. To produce at your peak level, you need to work for extended periods with full concentration on a single task, free from distraction. Put another way, the type of work that optimizes your performance is deep work. If you're not comfortable going deep for extended periods of time, it'll be difficult to get your performance to the peak levels of quality and quantity increasingly necessary to thrive professionally. Unless your talent and skills absolutely dwarf those of your competition, the deep workers among them will outproduce you. What about Jack Dorsey?
There they are.
I've now made my argument for why deep work supports abilities that are becoming increasingly important in our economy. Before we accept this conclusion, however, we must face a type of question that often arises when I discuss this topic. What about Jack Dorsey? Jack Dorsey helped found Twitter. After stepping down as CEO, he then launched the payment processing company Square. To quote a Forbes profile, he is a disruptor on a massive scale and a repeat offender.
Spike down
He is also someone who does not spend a lot of time in a state of deep work. Dorsey doesn't have the luxury of long periods of uninterrupted thinking, because at the time when the Forbes profile was written, he maintained management duties at both Twitter, where he remained chairman, and Square, leading to a tightly calibrated schedule that ensures that the companies have a predictable weekly cadence, and that also ensures that Dorsey's time and attention are severely fractured. Dorsey
30
reports,
seconds left.
for example, that he ends the average day with 30 to 40 sets of meeting notes that he reviews and
Spike
filters
planted.
at night. In the small spaces between all these meetings, he believes in serendipitous availability. I do a lot of my work at stand-up tables, which anyone can come
player
up to,
standing.
Dorsey said. I get to hear all these conversations around the company.
Screen down.
This style of work is not deep. To use a term from our previous section, Dorsey's attention residue is likely slathered on thick as he darts from one meeting to another, letting people interrupt him freely in the brief interludes in between. And yet, we cannot say that Dorsey's work is shallow, because shallow work, as defined in the introduction, is low value and easily replicable, while what Jack Dorsey does is incredibly
put as
valuable
opposed to
and highly
the fact
rewarded
that
in our economy. As of this writing, he was among the top 1,000 richest people in the world, with a net worth over $1.1 billion. Jack Dorsey is important to our discussion because he's an exemplar of a group we cannot ignore: individuals who thrive without depth. When I titled the motivating question of this section, "What about Jack Dorsey?" I was providing a specific example of a more general query.
Revealing
If
area.
deep work is so important, why are there distracted people who do well? To conclude this chapter, I want to address this question so it doesn't nag at your attention as we dive deeper into the topic of depth in the sections ahead. To start, we must first note that Jack Dorsey is a high-level executive of a large company. 2 companies, in fact. Individuals with such positions play a major role in the category of those who thrive without depth, because the lifestyle of such executives
Spike
is famously
down mid.
and unavoidably distracted. Here's Terry Trainor, CEO of Vimeo, trying to answer the question of how long he can go without email.
Taken out.
I can go a good solid Saturday without, well,
player
most of the
standing.
daytime without it. I mean, I'll check it, but I won't
One
necessarily
enemy remaining.
respond. At the same time, of course, these executives are better compensated and more important in the American
Match point.
economy today than in any other time in history. Jack Dorsey's success without depth is common at this elite level of management. Once we've stipulated this reality, we must then step back to remind ourselves that it doesn't undermine the general value of depth. Why? Because the necessity of distraction in these executives' work lives
Deep
is highly
correct.
specific to their particular jobs. A good chief executive is essentially a hard-to-automate decision engine, not unlike IBM's Jeopardy-playing Watson system. They have built up a hard-won repository of experience and have honed and proved an instinct for their market. They're
Scanning
then
ahead.
presented inputs throughout the day, in the form of emails, meetings, site visits, and the like, that they must process and act on. To ask a CEO to spend 4 hours thinking deeply about a single problem is a waste of what makes him or her valuable. It's better to hire 3 smart subordinates to think deeply about the problem and then bring their solutions to the executive
Right
for a
here.
final decision. This specificity is important because it tells us that if you're a high-level executive at a major company, you probably don't need the advice in the sections that follow. On the other hand, it also tells us that you cannot extrapolate the approach of these executives to other jobs. The fact that
Scanning
Dorsey encourages interruption, or Terry Trainor checks his email constantly, doesn't mean that you'll share their success if you follow
30
suit.
seconds left.
Their behaviors are characteristic of their specific roles as corporate officers. This rule of specificity should be
Spike
applied to
down,
similar
defender
counterexamples that come to mind while listening to the rest of this book. There are, we must continually remember, certain corners of our economy where depth
player
is not
standing.
valued. In addition to executives, we can also include, for example, certain types of salesmen
enemy
and
remaining.
lobbyists for whom constant connection is their
Attackers
most valued
win.
currency. There are even those who manage to grind out distracted success in fields where depth would help. But at the same time,